Today we are going to venture into the Gospels, and we're going to be looking at a very, very familiar passage, and we're going to discover some things there about that passage that I think are very important for us to see. So if you would, let's pick up in Luke 19, verse 1. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham." Okay, so let's set the stage for what's taking place here. Jesus was on his final journey to Jerusalem, and crowds were still following him, though they were not as large as they once were. And on the way, Jesus gave Bartimaeus his sight just before entering the city. And as usual, additional crowds began to gather and line the street as Jesus was passing through. Then as Jesus is passing through Jericho, we come to Zacchaeus. Now, this account is unique to Luke. It's not found anywhere else in the Gospels. And there's a lot here in these 10 verses, or should I say 9 verses, when we take a closer look. First, we have the village of Jericho. Jericho is located near the Jordan River, where John's ministry had been focused while he was alive. It was near the heart of the area where John's powerful preaching brought about a revival, so to speak, among many Jews as he prepared the way for Jesus, the Messiah. Matter of fact, Luke tells us, if you would, even tax collectors came to be baptized. "Teacher," they ask, "what should we do?" That's an interesting phrase. Even the tax collectors came to be baptized. So it is highly likely that Zacchaeus had heard John preach. But based on our text, he was not one that had been changed by the message. So then, who is this man named Zacchaeus? What does the text tell us about him to help us get a better grasp of why Luke felt that this was important? Well, there's a lot of speculation as to why Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus, ranging from mere curiosity to his conscience being plagued by his dishonesty and what he had become. Because as we look at the text, first of all, he wasn't just a tax collector. If you would, Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector, or publican is translated in the King James and other older translations. And that word that's translated publican in those translations, well, the original word in the Greek is a very derogatory name given to these people. You see, he wasn't just a publican or a tax collector. He's in management. He's managing these derogatory people. And add to that, he's a Jew. Now keep in mind, it was bad enough for a Jew to have to pay taxes to the Gentiles. All right? That was bad enough. But for a Jew to compromise and join the ranks of the Gentiles, the Romans, and help collect those taxes, well, that was abhorrent. They were considered the lowest of the low. As a matter of fact, if you would, they were considered traitors. Even to the extent, in some ways, they were not even considered Jews anymore. And many became tax collectors because, well, they could become wealthy. See, it was a political position in a sense that had little or no fiscal oversight. Oh, wow, does that kind of sound familiar? As long as the tax collector turned in what the Romans said was owed, they could care less if the tax collector inflated the amount that he collected and pocketed the difference as well as receiving his allotted pay. And while in this passage he is referred to as a sinner, in many other passages, tax collectors were mentioned separately, having been given their own lower standing of sinner. They weren't just considered sinners, they were a special kind of sinner, to be hated more than other sinners. For example, if you would, Matthew 9. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. And this is just one of several passages that make the distinction and put tax collectors in their own class of sinner and separates them out from the others. So, Zacchaeus is exceptionally hated because he is a tax collector. And even more so because he is Jewish and he has excelled at his work and achieved the position of a chief tax collector or publican, resulting in even more disdain for him by his fellow Jews. And for the most part, he hasn't cared if he was hated. Well, because he's excelled. He's wealthy. He lives rather comfortably. He has a Roman version of bodyguards protecting him because of the type service he is rendering for them. You might say, if you would, he was living the good life under the circumstances. Zacchaeus pretty much had it made, so why should he care if anybody hated him? So, we have Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector. So let's take a closer look at his story. If you would, back to verse 1. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. So on this particular day, Jesus is coming to town. We've already mentioned that he's on his final journey to Jerusalem, and no one knows that he's on his final trek to Jerusalem to be executed except him, even though he's told them what's going to happen. It's one of the interesting things. Over and over, he's told them this is going to happen. And when they got ready to go to Jerusalem this time, he told them this is what's going to happen when I get there. But they don't get it. They don't understand. But he's got to pass through Jericho on the way from where he is at. But everyone knows he's coming. And as he draws close to Jericho, people begin to crowd the streets just so they can see him. I mean, word probably quickly passes through the crowd that he gave Bartimaeus his sight just outside the city. And even Zacchaeus wants to see this unique rabbi who works miracles. Wants to see who he is. But it's more than a want as we look at the passage. There is a burning deep within Zacchaeus to see Jesus for some reason. So much so that he runs ahead of the crowd that is forming and climbs up into a tree so that he can see Jesus as he passes by. Because he's so short, he can't see over the crowds who would have pushed this tax collector to the back because of their disdain for him. And so as we look at this passage, we begin to see, if you would, Zacchaeus is determined to see Jesus. And he isn't going to let anything keep him from seeing him. He isn't going to let his job, his responsibilities to the Romans to collect taxes for them, stop him from seeing Jesus. He's not going to let the fact that he's short and the crowd's blocking his view. Zacchaeus is so determined to see Jesus that he will not let anything stop him. Contrast that with believers today. The majority of believers today will let other things be their excuse for not gathering with the body of Christ, rather than letting gathering with the body of Christ be their reason for missing everything else. I mean, you've heard it. I mean, maybe you've even said it yourself at times. I'll be there if nothing comes up. I've heard it many times. Various places, various people. I'll be there if nothing comes up. Or just been too busy. But for Zacchaeus, if you would, nothing was more important than seeing Jesus. Nothing was going to get in the way. Nothing was going to prevent him from seeing the miracle worker. I mean, think about it. Let's kind of get this in perspective here. There are a lot of football fans that will drive in heavy snow and sit outside in a snowstorm and watch a football game. But as soon as you get a little bit of snow on the ground, all of a sudden it's too dangerous to get to church. We can get to the football game in a snowstorm, but you get a little light coating, it's too dangerous to go to church. It makes me wonder if perhaps, if you would, our personal relationships with Christ have become too casual. So much so that we've become indifferent toward His body, the church. Could it be that we're more in tune with singing what a friend we have in Jesus than crown Him with many crowns? Could it be He's become more our buddy than our Lord and Master and King? The actions of many believers indicate they have a better relationship with their favorite sport than they do with Christ and His body. Or a better relationship with this club or that club than they do with Christ and His body. Or, if you would, a better relationship with, and you fill in the blank. So many believers have even become so casual in their relationship with Christ that the terminology they use is reprehensible. For example, referring to God as the man upstairs. That is absolutely disrespectful and demeaning and even borderlines on contempt for who God is. And yet there are so many Christians who will use that term, the man upstairs. Total disrespect for who God is. To lower Him to nothing more than somebody up the stairway. And yet, so many refer to God in those types of terms. It's no wonder that so many who profess to be Christians are no longer determined to gather with the body with the same determination that Zacchaeus showed when Jesus came through Jericho. He's just the man upstairs. Nothing special. And the same is true of his body. Nothing special there either. He's just a buddy. And I'll be there if nothing comes up. There's something else we see in Zacchaeus, if you would. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. So as we're looking at this, Zacchaeus isn't just determined to see Jesus, okay? If you would, he was willing to do whatever he had to do to see Jesus, even if it meant climbing a tree. Now let's put this in perspective, okay? Zacchaeus is a grown man. He is a servant of the Roman government. He holds a prominent position in the community, even though he is hated because of that position. And he's climbing a tree like a kid. Not only is he hated because he is a tax collector, now many would say, if you would, he's acting like a fool. Think about it. Would you be willing to do something that might make you look foolish just to see Jesus? Is there anything you wouldn't do? For Zacchaeus, there wasn't a wouldn't do list. He was prepared to do whatever he had to do in order to see Jesus. There wasn't anyone or anything that was going to stop him. He was determined to see Jesus regardless of what he had to do. Everything else could wait. Nothing else mattered. Seeing Jesus came first before everything else, even if he had to climb a tree and look like an idiot. He was going to see Jesus no matter what. Then let's look at what happens next, if you would. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. Remember what we talked about a few minutes ago. I'll be there if nothing comes up. In other words, I will let the world interfere with my commitment to Christ, His church, and is what that's actually saying. I'll be there unless there's something this world wants to do to interfere. Now think about what happened with Zacchaeus. If you would, Zacchaeus let Christ interfere with the world. It's clear that Zacchaeus came to look, but had no plan to ask Jesus to his house. In Zacchaeus' mind, he was going to go do whatever he had to do to see who this guy was. And then once he saw Jesus, and he would go back to work as a tax collector, and his day would go on as usual. Now I remember Warner Moore sharing with me his perspective of Christ and His church. He said that he writes everything down on his calendar. And if the church had something scheduled, he wrote it in on the calendar, and nothing else got put there or to replace it. And if he already had something written on that day, what was written in was either scratched out completely or rescheduled, and the church event replaced it. Christ and His church was allowed to interfere with the world. Boom. That is what this passage about Zacchaeus is showing us. Zacchaeus could have said, sorry, but I have to get back to work. I just came out to look, Jesus. I just wanted to see who you were. I've got work to do. I got to get back and get things taken care of. I mean, they're expecting me back at the tax collector's booth. But instead, if you would, Zacchaeus changed his schedule for the day to be with Jesus. Jesus was allowed to interfere with his world rather than the world interfering with Jesus. He immediately came down out of the tree, took Jesus to his house, and welcomed him. But how often is it that believers have it the other way around and let the world interfere? See, Zacchaeus put everything else for the day on hold and spent the rest of the day with Jesus because Jesus says, I need to spend the day at your house. Zacchaeus says, okay, great, let's do this. You might be thinking, well, yes, if Jesus actually came and invited himself to my house or invited me to his house, yeah, I would do that. Are you sure he hasn't? Seems to me as we search the Scriptures, he has. And it's interesting. Jesus has not only invited us to come to his house, he has invited us to be his house. And I want to make something very clear. This building is not the Lord's house. It's a building. We, the church, we are the Lord's house. The people, we are the temple of God. And the invitation has been extended. And yet, the vast majority of church buildings have plenty of room left, while supposed believers have something else that is more important to do. There's one more thing we learn about Zacchaeus, if you would. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus told him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham." We need to note something here. It's very clear that a period of time has passed from verse 6 to verse 7. What takes place in these last verses does not take place on the street beside the tree that Zacchaeus has climbed. They're not still out there. Because remember, it says Zacchaeus welcomed him. That means he took him home. They are at the home of Zacchaeus. They might even be eating a meal at this point. That was common. You welcome someone into your house, you feed them, you take care of them, you meet their needs. And notice, it says Zacchaeus stood up. It doesn't say he came down, it says he stood up. So he's sitting somewhere, or at that time they were reclining around a table. And Jesus said, "To this house." So they are possibly eating a meal and talking, but they are at Zacchaeus' house. And people are gossiping about who Jesus is associating with. Oh, that's common, isn't it? We saw that over and over. Oh, he's eating with publicans and sinners. He's eating with such and such over and over. He's associating with them. Disciples ask, why does your master do this? But as we look at the passage, it is apparent that Jesus is teaching Zacchaeus in the household and everyone gathered there, perhaps as they eat. And there comes a point where, if you would, Zacchaeus is convicted in his heart and knows he must change. And not just change. His change is a 180 that he wants to make restitution even to anyone he has cheated. He doesn't just want to go from this point on and be a different person. He wants to make amends for what he's done in the past. And notice, Jesus didn't tell him he needed to make restitution. But Zacchaeus is so deeply convicted that he wanted to do something to make things right with the people that he had wronged. That is a major change. You see, if you would, Zacchaeus was open to Jesus interfering in his world and changing him. And not a little change. A total transformation. So much so that Jesus claims that salvation had come to his household. As Jesus put it, if you would, Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham." Remember during our end time study, our discussion who the true Israel of God are, those who are his faithful servants? Jesus once made it clear that the same applies to being a son or child of Abraham. If you would, John 8. "Abraham is our father," they answered. "If you were Abraham's children," Jesus said, "then you would do what Abraham did." Not by bloodline, but by faith. So, Paul told us the Gentiles are also made heir to those promises through Christ as well. And so, if you would, Zacchaeus was a son of Abraham because of faith. He's called a son of Abraham because he became a faithful servant. He became a faithful servant because he was willing to let Jesus bring about a drastic change in him. And maybe that is why Luke, a Gentile Christian, sees Zacchaeus as being important and significant enough to record what happened when Matthew, Mark, and John did not. You see, Zacchaeus' story hits home with Luke. And there's something we need to understand that Zacchaeus shows us. When Jesus comes into our lives, if you would, he doesn't intend on leaving us the way we are. I mean, we've talked about that before. He does not intend on leaving us the way we are. Jesus intends to interfere with our lives. He intends to turn us upside down and inside out. He intends to shake up our world and change us in the process. But instead, what do? We fight him tooth and nail, don't we? And, well, I'll be there if nothing comes up. Let's face it. Jesus comes into our lives and we say, "Yes, Jesus, change me, Lord." But not too much. Oh, not that. Oh, no, not that either. But yeah, Jesus, change me. But only a little. I can't actually handle any real change in my life. I don't really want to be too different. Am I right? I mean, let's be honest. If you would, we are all for the idea of Christ changing us until the rubber meets the road and he goes to work on us and actually starts to change us. We're all for it until it actually starts to happen. And then come the proverbial meltdowns. Why is this happening? Why is that happening? It's not fair. Why? And like we just said, we need to understand. When Jesus comes into our lives, he intends to interfere with our lives, turn us upside down and inside out, shake up our world and change us. I'm going to be honest. If that hasn't happened or isn't happening, and we're not much different than we were when we came to Christ, then we need to legitimately ask ourselves, not God, but ask ourselves, why? Why am I not different? Why hasn't there been this change taking place in my life? And when the change is taking place, when the process is going on, is it easy? No. Is it really necessary? Oh, yeah. Will it be painful? Well, probably so, especially at first. But this I can promise you, if you would, it'll be worth it. Oh, and that short little man named Zacchaeus, that short little man who was determined to see Jesus, that short little man who wouldn't let anything stand in his way of seeing Jesus, that short little man who gladly let Jesus interfere with his plans for the day. Yeah, that short little man who was willing to let Jesus turn his world upside down and inside out and change him. If you would, that short little man named Zacchaeus left us a tall example of transforming faith to follow. You see, the story of Zacchaeus' story, if he was to sit down, that's one of the big things to say. Tell me your story. What's the story? Zacchaeus would sit down and tell you, let me share with you how I was transformed. Let me share with you how this is what I used to be like and this is what I'm like now. Let me share with you the difference that Jesus made in my life when he came into my life and turned everything upside down and made me what I am today. Yeah, that short little man's got a tall example to follow. Because he was willing to let Jesus do what was necessary to transform him completely. To make him a completely different person from the inside out. And it wasn't just a transformation in words. Think about it. Zacchaeus says, today I do this. In other words, he's saying, his words are saying, I'm putting this into action now. This is in effect, if any of his associates were there that managed, that he's over, that he has direction over, if any of them were there listening, he was basically saying, go through my stuff, give it to the poor, half of it to the poor. And go through the records and find out if I've cheated anybody. We're going to make this right today. Oh, not when I get around to it. Not next week after I get a chance to kind of get things organized. We'll do it today. Now, not later. With Zacchaeus, the change happened immediately. Not just in thought, but also in action. And so when we find this account of Zacchaeus slipped in here, as Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem to give his life for us, we've got a picture of what Jesus came to do in our lives. Change us. Make us different. And like I said, if there's not been some changing going on, it's not God we need to ask why. It's ourselves. Because we've got a tall example of transforming faith to follow. He was considered to be the worst of sinners. And Jesus transformed him. And everyone who comes into contact with Jesus, who is willing to let him work in their lives, is transformed. They come away a different person. New perspective on life. New perspective on reality. New perspective on who they are. Because part of that transforming process is we learn to see ourselves the way God sees us. Have you been giving God a difficult time making those changes in your life? Has He maybe started a few times and you've thrown a monkey wrench into it? Oh, it gets tough, doesn't it? It does. But like we said, it'll be worth it. Do you need to let Him begin that change process in you again and finish what He started? The Apostle Paul tells us in the context of letting Him do what He wants to do in our lives that He will finish what He starts in our life. He will finish that transformation process. And even though it may be difficult, even though it may be really difficult at times, it will be worth it. Are you ready to let Him begin completing that change process in you?